Today we're going to look at the terrifying pilot mistakes that killed one of the greatest rock bands of all time, Lynyrd Skynyrd. Walter McCreary and William Gray are two names that most people don't think of when they hear Lynyrd Skynyrd. And on October 20th, 1977, they were the two pilots that made several terrifying mistakes that ultimately led to them crashing the plane that Lynyrd Skynyrd was on, killing lead singer Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist and vocalist Steve Gaines, his sister and backup vocalist Cassie Gaines, and also their assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick. I'm Hoover and welcome to your pilot debrief. Walter McCreary was the captain for this terrifying flight. He was only 34 years old on the day of the crash. Walter had an airline transport pilot certificate with multi-engine ratings in several aircraft. He was a highly experienced pilot with just over 6,800 hours of total flight time, but he only had 68 hours in the Convair CV-240 aircraft that he was flying on the day of the crash. According to some sources, Walter actually used to be the co-pilot on a DC-3 aircraft that was owned by Jerry Lee Lewis, and the captain on that plane was a man named Les Long. Now, Jerry Lee allowed Lynyrd Skynyrd to use his plane until they could get their own. Les Long likely would have been the captain on that fateful day, but supposedly about 3 weeks prior to the crash, Les quit his job at Falcon Aviation, and that meant that Walter McCreary would move over to the left seat to be the captain, and this is the most likely explanation for why he has such a low number of flight hours in the CV-240. Sitting in the right seat of the CV-240 was William Gray. He was 32 years old and had a commercial pilot certificate with over 2,300 hours of flight time, but he too had very little experience in the CV-240, having logged only 38 hours. In my opinion, just one of the lessons of this tragedy that is still relevant today is that when you have a lot of flight time, it's easy to become overconfident in your abilities, and it can be very easy to make mistakes when you transition to a new aircraft, especially if you're flying with another pilot who is also new to the aircraft. Unfortunately, their lack of experience in the CV-240 was just one of the many issues that would jeopardize the lives of everyone on board. On October 11th, just 9 days before the crash, Lynyrd Skynyrd signed the agreement to lease the Convair CV-240 from the L&J Company of Addison, Texas. Now, the aircraft was manufactured back in 1947, so it was 30 years old and had just over 29,000 flight hours on it. The band's manager worked out a deal to lease it for just 3 payments of $5,000. And some of the band members felt like he was doing things on the cheap, even though they were one of the biggest bands in the world at the time, and they didn't really care for the plane, feeling like it was an insult to travel in it. The most unique thing about this aircraft that most people don't realize was that just 1 week prior to Lynyrd Skynyrd leasing it, Steven Tyler and Joe Perry from Aerosmith had also considered leasing it for their own tour. However, when one of their assistants went to inspect the aircraft, they saw the pilots passing a bottle of Jack Daniels back and forth. Either way, Aerosmith decided to find another option, and they considered themselves extremely lucky when they heard the news of the crash just a few weeks later. However, it's worth pointing out that after the crash, the toxicology report found no evidence of drugs or alcohol in the pilot's blood. 2 days before the crash, Walter and William were flying the plane from Lakeland, Florida to Greenville, South Carolina when they encountered a serious problem. According to Gene Odom, the band's security chief, just as we left the runway, the starboard engine backfired. The bang so loud I thought it had blown apart. The engine spewed out a 10-foot torch of fire that lasted for several minutes, offering each of us an unforgettable look at our very serious problem. According to the safety board report, right after this happened, a pilot qualified passenger visited the cockpit and noted that the right engine was being operated with the mixture control in the auto-rich position in order to alleviate the rough operating condition of the engine. When the plane landed in Greenville, there's varying accounts of how the pilots actually handled the engine problem. Some say that the pilots looked into getting the repairs done in Greenville, but it would have delayed the flight by at least a day, causing the band to have to cancel or delay the show in Baton Rouge. However, according to Gene Odom, just prior to takeoff, he asked the pilots about the engine problems, and he claims that the pilots insisted that the aircraft was fine and they'd call ahead for a mechanic to look things over in Baton Rouge. Either way, they didn't make any repairs to the engine prior to the flight, and there's no direct evidence that the band pressured the pilots to make the flight happen. However, some of the band members still felt very uneasy about boarding the plane. Cassie Gaines initially refused, and even suggested she could just ride in the band's equipment truck. Guitarist Alan Collins also didn't want to get on the plane. Eventually, Ronnie Van Zant convinced them both telling them, hey, if the Lord wants you to die on this plane, when it's your time, it's your time. Let's go, man. We've got a gig to do. According to the safety board, the engine malfunction was the only known mechanical issue on the aircraft, but unfortunately the engine damage sustained in the crash made it impossible to determine the source or the extent of the problem. And even with a faulty engine, there's no reason this plane should have crashed if the pilots had just avoided the other terrifying mistakes they made on the flight. On the day of the flight, Walter and William filed an IFR flight plan from Greenville, South Carolina to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They requested an altitude of 12,000 feet, and the planned flight time was 2 hours and 45 minutes. Their flight plans specified that they had 5 hours of fuel on board, but had they made a big mistake? Using the fuel purchase records, the safety board knew the aircraft departed Texas with 1,300 gallons of fuel. The pilots then made 6 stops in support of the tour, where they added a total of 1,650 gallons of fuel before taking off from Greenville, South Carolina. The total flight time from leaving Texas until they crashed was 13.5 hours. And based on the normal average fuel consumption for the CV-240, approximately 207 gallons of fuel should have still been on the plane at the crash site. In other words, they should have had about 3 hours and 45 minutes of fuel available for the 2 hour and 45 minute flight, so about 1 hour of extra fuel. This brings us back to why the pilots thought they had 5 hours of fuel on board. And this is where, in my opinion, it's possible that the pilots were relying on DC-3 fuel planning numbers, and Walter had acquired many of his hours on the DC-3 and was still new to the CV-240. It's also possible that the pilots simply just didn't keep track of their fuel between the flights and they were just guessing. Now, regardless of the reason for the mistake, they still had opportunities to save the aircraft if it weren't for the other mistakes that they made during the flight. Over the course of the next 2.5 hours, the band members relaxed in the back, not realizing the danger they were in. There was no flight data recorder or cockpit voice recorder installed on the aircraft because they weren't required, so almost nothing is known about the actions of the 2 pilots for the majority of the flight. It was only when they started their descent out of 12,000 feet that their problems were made known as they told the controller, "We need to get to an airport, the closest airport you've got, sir." It was at this point they realized they're running low on fuel, but they have no idea why. And they made a good decision by asking for the closest airport, but what they should have done is leveled off. You want to try to maintain altitude and don't start descending until you're sure that you can make it to the runway. You also want to declare an emergency, and then you want to have one pilot focused on flying the aircraft while the other pilot is monitoring the fuel, talking to air traffic control, and basically looking outside trying to find another suitable place to land in case you don't make it to the runway. We know that the controller asked them if they were an emergency aircraft, and one of the pilots responded, "Yes, sir. We're low on fuel and we're just about out of it. We want vectors to Macomb." This was actually another good decision by the pilots during these last few minutes of their flight because the Macomb-Pike County Airport was the closest airport to them at that time, but the pilots are about to make another big mistake. The controller immediately advised them to turn to a heading of 025 degrees, but the pilots didn't confirm the turn was initiated until about 1 minute and 20 seconds later. This is a lot of time they waste going in the wrong direction, and it's almost as if they were frozen in disbelief that they were almost out of fuel. Because about 20 seconds after they start the turn, one of the pilots actually told the controller, "We are not declaring an emergency, but we do need to get close to Macomb as straight and good as we can get, sir." Now, the safety board doesn't tell us which pilot is making the radio calls, but I think they're both actually talking on the radio because it seems like they know they've gotten themselves in a bad position, and one pilot is wanting to declare the emergency, but the other one isn't. In fact, about 30 seconds after they said they weren't declaring an emergency, one of the pilots told the controller, "Center, 5 Victor Mike, we're out of fuel." The controller responded, "Roger, understand you're out of fuel?" And the pilot replied, "I'm sorry, it's just an indication of it." This radio call almost suggests that at least one of the pilots didn't believe the fuel gauges. However, there was no evidence that the fuel gauges were bad. Regardless of the condition of the fuel gauges, the pilots clearly never had any concerns about the fuel, having assumed that they had at least 5 hours of fuel when they took off, and they never made any radio calls during the flight to indicate that there might have been a problem. But probably the most terrifying mistake they made is the one that ultimately caused the crash. The pilots never accounted for the problem with the right engine. Because they had to use an auto-rich fuel configuration during the flight to keep that engine running smoothly, this meant they were burning 25 gallons per hour more fuel than normal. And considering that problem started on the previous flight, there's no telling how much fuel they actually had on board when they left Greenville, and they basically ran out of fuel. The pilots tried to land in an open field, but they never made it, crashing in heavily wooded terrain just 8 miles south of the Macomb Airport. The plane was ripped apart upon impact. Both of the pilots were found dead and still in their seats, upside down in some trees, and none of the surviving band members would ever be the same. The safety board wrote in their final report that the crew is either negligent or ignorant of the increased fuel consumption because they failed to monitor adequately the engine instruments for fuel flow and fuel quantity. Additionally, the pilot was not prudent when he continued the flight with a known engine discrepancy. But the saddest part of the story is that all of these terrifying pilot mistakes could have easily been avoided. And if you like this pilot debrief, then be sure to watch this video on the screen here, and I'll see you next time.